Welcome back to More Than a Broker. A quick heads up for our listeners. We recorded this episode back in March. Given the fast-paced nature of news surrounding tariffs, please keep in mind that any related discussions reflect the information available at the time and may not align with the latest updates. Enjoy the episode.
Welcome to More Than a Broker, the podcast that goes beyond the traditional definition of a logistics provider. My name is Andrew Elsner, co-founder of Spot. In each episode, we will dive into the stories of industry experts, keep you up to date on the highs and lows of the logistics marketplace, and introduce you to the people behind the advanced technologies that are driving innovation for brokers, shippers, and carriers within our industry. Join us as we explore the world of logistics through a different lens. This is More Than a Broker.
Drivers, start your engine!
How did you get into covering supply chain?
The global economy in various forms for 25 years. So supply chains have always been at least a part of the stories that I've been writing about, but I never expected that I would actually write a book about the supply chain, which seemed like a wonky subject to me. I tend to write for a general audience, but I was living in London in the early part of the pandemic, and our baby was born in April of 2020, just about 5 years ago. And my wife was stoic about the fact that her parents couldn't fly over from New York to help out with the baby, and she can understand why we couldn't go see the pediatrician because the pediatrician's office, all the offices were closed. We couldn't get him registered. We couldn't get a birth certificate or a passport. But where she kind of lost it was we got back to our apartment, and she said, well, we ought to get some hand sanitizer. Couldn't find any throughout our North London neighborhood. Couldn't find it online. Everybody was out. And then we said, well, okay, we'll order the raw materials to make our own hand sanitizer. And even that was impossible. And she looked at me and said, you're supposed to know how this stuff works. What the hell is going on? And I realized I didn't have a satisfactory explanation. I started to do some digging. And about the same time, I was writing a lot of Brexit stories. I'd covered Britain's torturous exit from the European Union. And I was doing some stories about volatility in local shipping. I thought it was a Brexit phenomenon, but I was learning that, the cost of moving a container of factory goods from Asia to Ireland was up by 8 times in the stretch of a few months. And I thought, well, how is Brexit making that happen? I quickly figured out that, that was a global phenomenon and that shipping companies were just awash in business moving factory goods, principally from China to the West Coast of the United States, that this was jacking up the cost of shipping everywhere. And as I looked at this and then started to look at the role of just in time as well, I came to realize that I was looking at the breakdown of the kind of China-centric globalization we'd all been accustomed to, and that was worthy of a book-length treatment. And then, I had no idea that the supply chain would be so fascinating when you actually dig into its inner workings.
It's interesting. People pre-pandemic, a lot of people had no idea what we did. When the pandemic hits, it was crazy. Everybody was, just getting aluminum. We were sourcing cans that were moving typically at 200 miles. We're now moving thousands of miles across the country because there was no aluminum. So it was crazy. So how did you come up with the title, How the World Ran Out of Everything?
I stole it from a headline that a smart editor wrote. I started to write about product shortages, and I then focused on the role of just in time. And I was familiar with the concept of just in time and the Toyota production system and the idea of lean manufacturing. But it wasn't until I started to talk to people who had grasped kind of the details of inventory management that I came to see that the global economy had for decades at that point been running on very, very lean inventory. Some of that's very sensible. Certainly the Toyota story is sensible, but some of that was excessive financialization. And I tell the story in the book of McKinsey in particular, but you could indict any consultancy for persuading executives of publicly traded companies, why don't you just liquidate all your inventory, Take the money that you're spending stashing parts and extra products in warehouses, give it to yourself, through trumped up compensation packages as a reward for being smart enough to hire McKinsey. Give it to your shareholder, they'll love it. And everything will be great until it isn't. But with any luck, you'll be retired and have cashed your stock options and be on a beach, holding a cocktail aligned in a hammock somewhere. And so I started to look into that. And I wrote this story about the significance of lean inventory in the product shortages that by the time I wrote that story, people were familiar with, though they weren't clear on why. And a smart editor took my overly tortured headline, which was how the world ran out of tapioca beads and lumber, and just turned it into everything. And I just loved that and thought that'd be a good title for the book.
What's interesting too, when packaging, like in packaging industry, no one keeps inventory. So you get a load of bottles, it has to come in. And if it's not there, you shut down production right away. During post-COVID, I think a lot of people back in the shipping world have gone back to the JIT model, and we're back to the lean inventories that we saw. And during COVID, it was OTIF was big, on time in full is the term we use by Walmart. It's gone backwards. Now we're back to on time in full, and it has to be there when you need it to compete with the Amazons of the world. It's really changed supply chains.
Yeah, I don't think that there's anything wrong with just-in-time. In fact, there's a lot right about just-in-time if you're doing it in the right way and for the right reasons. And certainly, if a company like Walmart starts to move some of their production from China to Mexico to serve the North American market, then it makes more sense to do lean inventory. If you're in Mexico and you can truck or rail your stuff up from a factory that's no more than, a few days away, makes more sense to have lean inventory than if you're dependent upon some container ship that's effectively part of a global cartel that can jack up the price or kick your can off the deck at any point if they could figure out how to charge somebody more. That makes a certain amount of sense. The question is, who's directing it and for what purpose? I mean, the craziest story that I discovered in the course of researching my book was I talked to a railroad engineer at Union Pacific. It was based in Idaho, who discovered that he was routinely pulling containers to the wrong destination. And at first he thought, well, this must be, some sort of error. And then he discovered that what was going on was that rail, your audience is probably familiar with, is run by precision scheduled railroading, which is essentially just in time on the rails. And Union Pacific, like the other publicly traded railroads that are quasi-monopolies, have persuaded Wall Street that the way to show that they were really nailing it on precision scheduled railroading was to reduce dwell time. Now, dwell time is this neat little metric that tells us how long a container stays in any place for any given amount of time. And so the idea is if you make dwell time go down, then you'll make Wall Street happy. They'll see how efficient you are and they'll buy your shares. Well, so some guy running the Union Pacific Rail Yard in Nebraska takes away from this that his job is to stick as many rail cars on the next train coming through, regardless of where it's going. So he's doing his part to lower dwell time. So it doesn't matter that this particular train's going to Oregon and he's got all these barrels full of chemicals that are supposed to be going to Southern California. He's got auto parts that are supposed to be going to Northern California. I'm just going to catch him there. Hey, look, we lowered dwell time, mission accomplished. Wall Street doesn't understand more than, what does it say on the Excel spreadsheet about dwell time? So, there's an example of how just-in-time thinking produces something that is totally inefficient and insane. And if it wasn't for the fact that you've got Wall Street investors who aren't digging deeply into operations, dictating what's happening, that just wouldn't happen. I mean, no privately run business would ever run itself that way.
It's a cost. One of the questions I get, and I thought you wrote an interesting article on it, is reciprocal tariffs. And I think from our standpoint in the trucking world, we look at this and say, everybody, when we had the last in 2018, we had a trucking recession. The volumes went way down post 16 into the trade wars when that started. It really affected us. And it didn't pick back up really until late 19. And then pandemic hit. So what are your thoughts? How will reciprocal tariffs really play out over time?
Depends upon whether they really do them and how they do them. It seems like they are going to do them. The word is that by April 1st, the Trump administration is going to give us some form of reciprocal tariffs. Look, if this is a bargaining chip, then presumably it could be a way to force some countries that are charging American exporters a lot more on tariffs, going out of the United States than we're charging incoming shipments. Could be a way to reduce that, and that could be beneficial. But if the Trump administration really thinks that reciprocity is the ultimate goal, then it will be both chaotic and more expensive. Because let's face it, like what we charge for a pair of shoes coming in from Vietnam to the United States is much more important than what Vietnam charges American producers of shoes, because there are hardly any American producers of shoes, and you'd have to look it up, but I'd be willing to bet my house that we don't send a lot of shoes from the United States to Vietnam. So if we're going to have parity there, then what we're going to do is jack up the price of shoes. And we're going to make distributors very confused about how many shoes they should be ordering from where, especially if it turns out that this is really transactional. If the MO of the Trump administration continues to be, I'm going to figure out how to use every kind of policy, trade policy, environmental policy, tax policy, to punish my enemies and benefit my friends, well, how's a global business supposed to make sense of what's the right place to source from? We've seen this kind of uncertainty since the beginning of the administration. I happen to have spent some time in Colombia with a Minnesota-based medical device manufacturer, MedSource Labs. They had moved production from China to Colombia thinking that's beyond the reach of tariffs. We assume if Trump comes back, or even if Biden gives way to Harris, whoever wins, we're going to have this decoupling from China. So it makes sense to look for a different place to make our stuff that China, Colombia, that's, far beyond the threat. Well, the first week in office, and actually a week after I came back from Colombia, Trump, of course, threatens 25% tariffs on all incoming shipments of everything from Colombia because of his assertion that the Colombian government wasn't accepting plane loads full of deported immigrants. So that kind of uncertainty leads to chaos, which makes it very hard for companies to run, invest, and source.
So globalization, like come out of the 90s and the 2000s, and like when you mentioned earlier, China joins the WTO and their investment in production changes greatly. And as you just mentioned, buying shoes from Vietnam, and is there a shoe factory in the United States, really? Do you think post-pandemic, and all the people that you've met with and all your research, do you think we're forever changed? Did the pandemic really change the way we look at manufacturing and globalization long term?
Yeah, I think in some ways, sure. Because the pandemic exposed tensions that were already there. I wrote my first supply chain disruption story back in 1999 when there was an earthquake in Taiwan. And at that point, Taiwan was already a huge supplier of semiconductors, not as big as now, but still very significant. And there were shortages, and people said, maybe we've overdone it relying on this one island that's 90 miles off the coast of China, a country that not incidentally claims Taiwan as part of its own territory. Maybe it's not such a great idea to concentrate the brains of modern manufacturing there. And nothing changed. And Fukushima, the nuclear disaster in Japan in 2011 and into 2012, massive shortages of electronics, semiconductors, machinery, same thing. I mean, guy I talked to for the book, an economist at Oxford named Ian Golden, wrote a book that came out in 2014 called The Butterfly Defect that predicted that there would be something like a pandemic or some natural disaster that would lead to a financial crisis and just devastate global manufacturing. Really pretty prescient prediction of what would happen. And it was tuned out because, again, if you're running a publicly traded company and you know that something bad will eventually happen, because that's life, stuff happens, right? But it's probably not happening this quarter, which is the quarter that you're most interested in. Then if you say, well, let's, move production around, let's not concentrate all of our eggs in the China basket, let's have a backup plan. 10 years from now, when something bad happens, if anybody remembers, they'll say, well, thank God we listened to that guy. But there's a good chance you'll be out of a job. Some activist investor, some Bill Ackman or Dan Loeb will come after you and say, how come your margins aren't the same as your competitor and you're gone? Whereas if you're the CEO who says, yeah, I'm just going to tune out all this doomsaying stuff because let's face it, again, this quarter, it's unlikely anything bad's going to happen. I'm just going to keep sourcing from China because I get the best price. They can make it at scale. Well, again, with any luck, by the time something bad happens to reveal that that was a stupid thing to do, you're gone in one of your mansions. And that's still true. Those incentives are still in place. So we do see that consumers are certainly thinking more about place than they did before. The political class has certainly taken note of the fact that it's not a great idea to depend upon a single country that we're having a trade war with to make N95 masks, medical gowns, basic materials for drugs, to say nothing of, exercise bikes and all the other stuff that we buy from China. And that's prompted the Walmarts and the Amazons and the Targets to think a little bit more about diversification, but they have the money to do that. Smaller businesses, like the company I profile in the book, this company Glow that makes these novelty light up cubes, and they were making Elmo themed Sesame Street bath toys. I followed their first 40-foot container ever from their factory in China to their warehouse in Mississippi. They don't have the money to just pick up and move. And China's still, it's an unbeatable proposition in many respects.
That was interesting when you wrote about that, the cost change on the container. As a small business, having to jack your price up $1,000 or pay 20-some thousand to get a container moved back then, it was crazy. It was interesting. Like most people have no idea when you profiled that story from the time it got down to their small business. The common person had no idea what was going on, but those price fluctuations it was real.
Oh, it's shocking. And the exporters got hit even harder than the importers. I mean, I spent time with almond farmers. I'm out in the Central Valley of California in the spring of 2022. Almond farmers are having a great crop, which would normally be the source of excitement and positive feeling. And they're dealing with the fact that they're still sitting on the previous year's crop, unsold, piled to the rafters. I visited with one guy who was like building temporary sheds in his parking lot to store the almonds he had harvested and sold from the previous year. He had contracts with buyers in Dubai, but he can't get the carriers to stop at the port of Oakland to pick them up because normally the carriers, they bring in factory goods from China. They unload at LA Long Beach. They take some empties. They ship them by rail or truck up to the Central Valley. They load them up with things like almonds, hugely important crop in the United States. And out they go from Oakland to Dubai, to Japan, wherever. Well, now, because the price of a shipping container from Shanghai to the West Coast of the U.S. has gone from $2,500 pre-pandemic to north of $25,000 for that single container. The carriers are saying, we don't have time to load almonds. We're going to take the empties. We're going to put them right back on the ship, send them back across the Pacific as quickly as possible. Think about that. We're burning diesel fuel to move air across the Pacific Ocean because they can make so much money. It's a gold rush loading up with the next wave of factory goods. So the almond guys are like, there's no ships in Oakland. They're not even landing here.
Fighting for containers. We do a lot of produce. Loads of produce, celery, let's say, would go into the Midwest out of California where $3,000 normally, $3,400 per truckload at the peak in 21, 22. We were paying $12,000 to $15,000 per load, moving 10, 20 loads a day to the Midwest. You think about the consumer, the cost of celery is nothing, but now it's like it was skyrocketing.
Right. And part of that, as I understand it, is that the carriers were very reluctant to allow containers to go inland because they wanted those boxes back in China as quick as possible. And like, no, thank you. I don't want to go to Chicago or Kansas City or wherever.
Because you got to get it back. So they have
That's
deals.
right.
It was just a crazy phenomenon during that time to see that happen. So I think now we're leveled back off, but it's still a crazy shift. You covered China during they come into how has it been from your perspective, covering them coming into the WTO? How has that really impact globalization? I mean, from your seat, watching that happen, I think is an interesting perspective.
China became the solution to every executive's problem of how do you lower costs. But I think that what's striking to me is how we've come to talk about China as the sort of monolithic, job-killing juggernaut, almost like a conspiracy to destroy American middle-class security. Of course, the effect has been to damage communities that have seen a surge of imports. But I think it's really important, and I tell this story in the book, to remember how China ends up in the WTO. Ends up in the WTO in part because the Chinese Communist Party uses its one-party state power to invest aggressively in infrastructure, ports, highways, warehouses. They skill up the workforce to make the transition from farm to factory. But the key thing is that Western companies, including American companies, lobbied the Clinton administration very aggressively to get China into the WTO because that was the way to get out from under unions, workplace safety standards, environmental regulations at home. And it served the interests of the investor class. Publicly traded companies in general did very well moving production to China because you could make your stuff extremely economically at scale. And so it's a bit of revisionist history to act as if, China is like this thing that has happened to us as opposed to something that we've done to ourselves. Moreover, there are plenty of countries that have integrated more than the U.S. that are not seething with this kind of populist anger, part because we've done a very poor job of helping out the people in harm's way. I mean, trade creates winners and losers. That's not a new observation, right? And the winners tend to be spread very broadly, right? So the winners are like anybody who's ever bought anything on Amazon in the last 25 years. Anybody who's walked in Walmart to go buy a badminton set, congratulations, you're the winner of globalization. You just saved a couple of bucks. The losers are profoundly harmed. And you can go to a town like an auto town in the upper Midwest where suddenly everybody's out of a job at once. Everybody's house is underwater. And unlike in the rest of the world, we don't have national health care. We don't have job training. We have, trade adjustment assistance, but it's always woefully underfunded. And we don't have help with housing when a whole community, loses its livelihood. So a lot of that kind of conversation, which is real and important, kind of gets lumped in with the trade conversation. And we talk about China like China did that to us. We did that to us.
What do you think the role of the WTO is? Do they play a role in any of this that's of any significance in the current?
Now?
Yeah, now. Do you think is there anything they can do?
The WTO, it's sad to say, is largely irrelevant. I mean, it's barely in existence. I mean, Trump used the nuclear option, right, in citing national security justifications for breaching WTO rules and just saying we're going to slap whatever tariffs we like on steel and aluminum from allies, Canada, Britain, Mexico. And then the Biden administration continued that by maintaining those tariffs and then refusing to appoint new judges. So you can't even adjudicate a case. I mean, the old days, you could say, well, if you don't like the deal you're getting, if you think you're getting a raw deal from a competitor, you take him to the WTO. And that was slow. And that was always a problem. And the rules weren't particularly good on areas like subsidies, which are very relevant for China, right? I mean, there's no question that the Chinese state subsidizes lots of industry. There's not really that much you can do about that at WTO. But even if you could, the Biden administration ensured that you can't because we now don't even have enough judges to hear your case. So the fact that the lights are even on at the WTO headquarters in Geneva is kind of miraculous.
You did an interesting piece, I thought, on the Panama Canal. In our industry, like everything comes in. So we're in trucking, domestic, first mile, final mile OTR. But can you highlight some of that? Because I thought it was very interesting. I had no idea that, you hear stories of the Panama Canal, but you went there.
Yeah, I thought it was fascinating. Yeah, I actually got in a helicopter with a photographer to get it over an aerial view, which was fascinating. So yeah, I didn't know much about the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal, it turns out, is entirely dependent upon a freshwater lake in the center of the isthmus. And if it doesn't rain enough, then you don't have enough water to release. It's a system where water flows downhill in both directions, right? The lake's at the high point, flows down in both directions. So when you want a ship to come through, you have a series of locks. You use that natural gravitational flow to fill up locks, to move the ships in and the ships across the lake and out. It's not just like a slice through the land as if the ocean itself is flowing. So climate change has limited rainfall, has made rainfall more volatile. They had a series of really terrible droughts last year, and they were forced to restrict the numbers of vessels they could pass through from something like 38 or 40 a day down to 22 a day at one point. So you've got giant ships, container ships, break bulk vessels, tankers full of various kinds of energy that are just stuck waiting for their turn to pass through the canal. This, of course, is happening at the same time that the Houthis, the rebels in Yemen, are opening fire on ships headed toward the Red Sea in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza. And the result of that is the Suez Canal is effectively closed. Now, the Suez Canal is this vital way for ships to move from Asia to Europe and back and forth. So at the same time that you can't get as many ships through the Panama Canal, you can't get through the Suez Canal at all. So ships now have to go the long way around Africa to get between Asia and Europe, which adds cost. It requires more ships for the carriers to maintain daily services. All of this is an argument for thinking about shrinking the distance between your factory and your customer. And that's what was happening.
Is there a long-term solution to it? Are they going to move?
Oh, I'm sorry. To the Panama Canal. Well, I mean, they're actively planning a new lake, a man-made lake that involves flooding a bunch of communities that are home to thousands of people who are not real happy about that. That could be the fix, but you're going to have to compensate those people. You're going to have to move them.
You wrote an interesting piece I loved on, if you think back to California, the pandemic, all the boats stuck out in the water. I mean, we had customers that we do exercise equipment, and everybody was starting to buy exercise equipment. Normally came in the port of California. We were moving it all the way around to Georgia. Boat costing like $1 million just to go get this across. When you covered that, I thought it was very interesting. And you talked about the pounds and the things on this and the dollars associated with it. I guess for most people look at it, how much money typically sits on one of those boats? So you think about total dollar amount in goods that sits on those boats that sit out of port.
Any given day, you had, by some estimates, $25 billion worth of stuff just floating off ports around the world. 25 billion with a B, just stuck out there, floating traffic jams.
There was at one point like 70 some boats just sitting out in the water waiting to get offloaded. And then you couldn't get trucks down over there to get them off fast enough. So they could get offloaded, but then you couldn't even truck it cross country because there weren't enough workers or drivers.
I mean, what we learned is that every time you mess with the flow in one place, you have unexpected problems pop up in the other place. But back to our conversation about just in time. I mean, rail should have been able to pick up a lot of that slack, except rail had so overdone it with just in time, including, closing this key ramp into Chicago and consolidating, consolidating, there's a fancy word for, cut, right? Cut service in Southern California. So just as rail was needed most, it couldn't handle it.
We had shippers, typically they'd move thousands of loads on the rail. We're all going over the road. And so then the cost over the road went way out of control, and you couldn't get enough trucks to cover it. It was the truckload market really went off. It went crazy, and the rail was slower. It was backed up, but they were pretty busy. So one of the questions that I get a lot too across the country, a lot of our shipper partners that we work with, is nearshoring. We see a lot of our trucking companies starting to pop up down close to Mexico and Texas and California, warehouses going up. Do you think this nearshoring or onshoring movement continues 5-10 years from now as we look down in the horizon?
I would have said, yeah, for the simple reason that if you've decided that it's a bad idea to depend so heavily on China for your production, for whatever your reason, you don't like human rights abuses, you don't like dealing with the Communist Party government, you buy the Cold War thinking. That's not my own thinking, but if you think we're supposed to have a Cold War with China and let's not trade with China, that's bad, then Mexico ought to be the solution for a whole bunch of reasons. And one of them is that when we buy a good from Mexico in the United States, somewhere between 30 and 40 cents on the dollar for the value of that good is actually made in the U.S. by American workers because there's so much integration under first NAFTA, now the USMCA, which was the renegotiated NAFTA during the first Trump administration. There's so much integration that the auto industry, operates across the borders of Canada, Mexico, and the United States. And so we're helping our own livelihood when we trade with Mexico. The counterpart number for China, 3 cents on the dollar. When we buy $1 worth of goods from China, 3 cents made in the United States, and Chinese state policy is directed to driving that as close to zero as possible. So we ought to look to Mexico as our solution to our quote unquote China problem. But I don't have to tell you and your audience, these tariffs that are now on any given day operative or suspended or who knows what, it's no longer a safe bet to think that you can make your stuff in Mexico. And anybody running a company who's taken note of what's happened since January 20th has got to think long and hard about whether they can safely invest or expand in Mexico and think they're going to get their stuff into the U.S. duty-free.
2 weeks ago, we do a lot of cross-border into Mexico and Canada. The cost of a truck to go cross-border, one of the lanes we typically runs about $1,700, so per truckload. 2 weeks ago, when everything started coming down, the cost of that same truck went to $6,000. We were paying because the trucks weren't coming press and everybody was trying to get more product off before this all went into effect. It was
before the tariffs.
Well, then it's real. We have a lot of customers from alcohol to food, especially like in the alcohol and metal world. The day that the announcement came across an increase, it's hurting alcohol sales. A lot of American spirits that come across into the sales forecasts are going to be off. And so it has real impacts across the cost of the goods we buy. What do you think as you look down and all your work that you've covered, do you have a sense of or a thought what's going to happen over the next couple years if tariffs stay in place, what will happen to the consumer and to American manufacturing?
I've never been so unsure of what's going to happen. Because if these tariffs stay in place, these tariffs are sold as a way to bring production back to the United States. If these tariffs actually stay in place, they're going to destroy jobs that are already here. And this is something that investors understand. The stock markets are recoiling the more that they get the sense that these tariffs are real. And during the first Trump term, a falling stock market seemed to change policy. And now that doesn't seem to be the case. And it seems like Trump wants tariffs there to make everybody uncertain. He keeps saying, you're worried about tariffs? Make your stuff in the U.S. That's how you avoid tariffs. The problem is that you can't just wave a magic wand and make global supply chains go away. And I was visiting a few weeks ago with a industrial pump company in Louisville, Kentucky. This is 86-year-old family-owned business, fourth generation in family operation. They had resisted the temptation over the years to move production to China, to Mexico, to save costs. They view themselves as, look, we're a local company. We're in Louisville. That's our home. We got our factory that we've been in since 1940s, and this is where we're here to stay. And I was talking to the CEO, and he said, look, we have a factory in Canada that makes part of our pump. If we got to pay a 25% tariff to bring in something from our peaceful neighbor to the north that policy has encouraged us to invest in, and that, by the way, has similar wage standards. It's not like we're undercutting American labor to go invest in Canada. Well, that's going to make us uncompetitive. We're going to lose sales to Chinese competitors. That's the net effect of that policy. That policy does not make any sense on its face. And in fact, I said to him, what do you think's going on? So this policy is supposed to make production come back to the U.S. He said, we're already here. If we're the bad guys in this, then everybody's the bad guys. And I also have to tell you just a brief anecdote that comes to mind. Later that day, I visited a bourbon distillery because, of course, the bourbon guys were worried about retaliation tariffs that have come to pass. And I'm taking this tour in this bourbon distillery in downtown Louisville, this handsome brick building. And the kind of young hipster guy who's showing us around is like, well, bourbon's got to be 51% corn. Here's the corn we use. It comes in from a neighboring county. Here's the barley. We buy it from someplace in Ohio. Here's the rye. We buy it from Canada. Some guy behind me says, why do you buy rye from Canada? And the guy says, well, it's cheap. It's good quality. It's close by. And I says, well, if you're buying rye from Canada, how can you call yourself an American brand? Well, I mean, we're in America. Our distillery's here. Our employees are here in America. You're here. We're drinking our whiskey. And I asked the tour guide afterwards, I said, how often do you get that question? He said, 2 or 3 times a day. I mean, if we're at a point where you can't make bourbon in Louisville, Kentucky with a little bit of rye from Canada without having your nationalist cred questioned, I don't know what the hell we're supposed to do about that.
All the parts that come into, from cannons to car parts, I mean, we send car seats down to get kitted, and then they have to come back into the States, and then they're so interconnected. But I was at lunch with actually a large bourbon company last week when a lot of the stuff, there's news coming out on aluminum and other stuff coming across border, and it's a real impact to these people. It all of a sudden, I mean, you have to ship it across, and then their sales go down. It has real world impacts back here at home, and you could feel it in talking to them. This is real.
Sure. I mean, think about just what happens to the marketing company that's got a smaller market is fear demand for ads. What happens to the catering company that would be doing the corporate function that's now slimmed down because the bourbon distilleries? I was at a restaurant right in the bourbon country and it seemed a little bit empty. Everybody's nervous about these tariffs. I mean, the ripple effects, any big industry, you hit a big industry, it's going to hit a whole bunch of other industries. Whether you're talking about lawyers or truck drivers or dry cleaners or janitor, whoever, whatever you do, we're all connected.
Even just the story I was telling about the trucks going cross border, to see that price increase. I mean, it was literally overnight. And all these shippers, they have budgets already set. So when you're moving a truck that was normally costing $1,700 and you're paying $3,000, you're moving hundreds of loads. That adds up real quick. All of a sudden, you're way over budget by $1 million, and it can easily happen. And the ripple effects are quicker than what it used to be.
You don't need a PhD in economics to understand. You hit my income, you just hit the income of all the places where I spend my money. We all know that.
It ends up on the consumer's plate, or takes away from their plate long term.
And you hit businesses.
Do you think country-wise, is India starting to become a bigger player in manufacturing from a port perspective?
Yeah. India is in an interesting situation because, India really missed out on the East Asian miracle, right? So we saw first in countries like Japan and then South Korea, Taiwan, and then China, and then Southeast Asia, we saw lots of countries lift enormous numbers of people out of poverty on the strength of the transition from agriculture to factory. Well, India missed out on that altogether for a whole bunch of reasons. They didn't invest in infrastructure. There was a lot of protectionism, a lot of distrust for global trade. They didn't build up the skills. Women are really kept out of the workforce, and women have been critical to the factory boom all across East and Southeast Asia. So that's changing now. There's a recognition that this is a pretty good opportunity, that if the U.S. and even Europe are going to look at China as a problem in terms of excessive reliance, well, we're not all going to make everything back in our home countries. I mean, that may be a good political speech, but we're not making tube socks and T-shirts in the Carolinas again. We're not making furniture in Tennessee. That's just not going to happen. So it's going to be made somewhere else that's cheaper. And India is the one country that, at least on paper, has some of the attributes that China had when the China boom happened. I mean, it is the world's most populous country. They have incredible natural resources. Now, in the short term, they're still very dependent upon things like electronics from China, chemicals from China. And the wild card is that Narendra Modi, the Indian president, is very hostile to the Muslim minority, and there's a lot of social strife as a result. And there's reputational problems for multinational companies that are depending too heavily on India. But Walmart is in the process of tripling their sourcing from India. They're moving some production from China to India. They got a goal of, I think, 10 billion US a year in sourcing from India by 2030, if memory serves. That's coming off the top of my head. Don't hold me to that number, but it's real. And I've been over there and visited the factories. And India is certainly emerging as a significant center of manufacturing.
They've invested on their ports too, right?
Yeah, they're in the midst of a big port build out. India, actually, I was interested to learn on my last trip there in May, entirely dependent upon Colombo in Sri Lanka and Singapore for really large container vessels. So everything's transshipped from smaller ports, but they're developing huge container ports on the west coast of the country. There are a couple of big ports that are underway that will allow stuff to be shipped directly from India to Europe and to the U.S. without having to be transshipped somewhere along the way.
Did you write in one of your pieces, you were talking about the boats maybe that come into the ports. Are they going to be levying a fee or something for Chinese boats that come into the ports?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And actually, it's not just Chinese boats. Yes. So the Trump administration just announced a few weeks ago that they're going ahead with an undertaking that actually started under the Biden administration. This look at putting $1 million surcharges per port visit on Chinese-made vessels. But the way they've written this rule, and there's going to be a lot of lobbying against these details from many industries, the way they've written the rule is if you are a carrier, if you're Maersk or Hapag-Lloyd or whoever, you may have 250 vessels. And if one of them is made in China, every vessel that makes a stop anywhere in the United States has to pay $1 million per stop. So think about that.
That's a lot of money.
This is being sold as a way to revive shipbuilding in the U.S., which may or may not be a good goal, but it's not happening quick. Like, it takes years and billions of dollars to start making this stuff at scale.
How long does it take to build one of those boats? I mean, it's got to be years, right?
It certainly takes months, and to build a whole fleet could take a decade. I mean, imagine if, 10 years ago, China had said, well, we want self-sufficiency at the same time that we're trying to industrialize. So we want to build out our airlines, but no Boeing, no Airbus. They'd be nowhere. Why would we do that to ourselves? I mean, if you think it's an important goal to wean yourself from the Chinese supply chain for ships, hey, that's understandable. We are more and more feeling like we're in a Cold War, and it does make sense to be in control of your own destiny. And that is the justification for reshoring, nearshoring, limiting your exposure to whatever's happening in the container industry. And it could be a reason to, give tax credits to companies that are willing to make ships in the U.S. But you got to give companies time to adjust to this.
Just to build up to it, from the raw materials, the workers, takes work.
And by the way, this is happening at the same time that we're slapping 50% tariffs on steel coming in from Canada, which is our primary supplier of steel. So run that by me again. We're supposed to be promoting domestic shipbuilding while we're jacking up the price of steel by 50%.
Doesn't add up. How many countries have you visited?
I counted once. I don't know, 50 something.
Wow. What was the most unique place you've ever been to?
I don't know. I spent some time in Sudan, now South Sudan, but it was still Sudan then. That was pretty different than any other place I had been. I've had some adventures in many places. I was in Iraq during the war in 2003. That was pretty eye-opening.
What's next? So you wrote the book. Where are you going to focus on or explore next?
Well, I'm actually working on a project on lead recycling. I don't know if that's a subject you know anything about. I'm trying to figure out how battery manufacturers in the U.S. are importing growing volumes of lead.
Yeah. We ship a lot of batteries.
Do you?
Oh, yeah. And then we do the recycled. So we will pick up the used cores and then we'll truck them back and truck out the new. So it's, an interesting thing, and I don't know if you've looked into it at all, is theft, freight theft in the United States.
Theft of batteries?
No, everything. It is one of the craziest phenomenons going on right now. We'll probably be out, I'll have to pay out of pocket over $3 million in stolen loads.
Wow. Like what kind of stuff?
They're to the point now, they hack into computer systems and then they'll put magnets and they take the back of doors off and they'll pilfer freight. I mean, the FBI, everybody's into it, from copper, exercise equipment, beverage, food. It's multi-billion-dollar issue.
That's really interesting. And where does that stuff get sold?
So we don't know. Like, we trace it back a lot into Texas, California, and they're paying these truckers, they're telling them it's blind shipments, and they pay them over Zelle, and they'll take the loads to these cross docks, and there's cross dock operations. I mean, we had different mafia groups that we got the FBI to bust. It's really a big issue right now.
These are crazy times we're living in.
We are living in crazy times. I really appreciate it. I just started the book. I'm in the first chapter now.
Oh, I hope you like it. Let me know what you think.
It's interesting, just like we lived through the stuff you're writing about, and to most people had no idea what was going on the backside of it, and just how much the world really impacts what we buy and how the supply chains are so interconnected.
I never expected to be at like a barbecue hanging out with regular people. Like, tell me about the supply chain. I didn't have that on my bingo card.
It was nuts because a lot of our customers, like we were air freighting, which for $300,000, which would have been a normal truckload because they were so out of the product and it took so long to get out of the port. So normally we would have intermodaled it, put it on a rail, or we'd have trucked it from California, but we put it on a jet. And that cost of the truck would have been, if I railed it, would have been $2,000, $3,000, but you paid a couple $100,000 to get the product out to market.
Yeah, no, you're sitting in the middle of something crazy.
Well, I really appreciate it. It's been great.
Oh, thanks for your interest.
And that's a wrap for More Than a Broker. You heard firsthand accounts from industry experts and Spot's hardworking individuals revealing a culture of collaboration and innovation. For more information about Spot, our service offerings, our people and culture, our job postings and more, check us out online at spotinc.com. That is spotinc.com. Thank you for listening and for being part of this journey. Until next time, keep striving to be more than a broker.